Hello everyone, once again just like I did for the German line, this will be an extremely shortened version of my full British line review for anyone who doesn't want to listen to me yap about every single ship in the line. I still suggest checking out that video linked below in the description if you have any questions or curiosities about specific ships. Moving right into it with the destroyers for the British line, the British destroyers are an interesting multi-purpose destroyer mix that excel if their captain knows when to push their advantage and when to hold back. These destroyers will tend to lose fights against more specialized ships, especially in terms of close-range gun battles. The guns themselves tend to be reliant on high explosive shells for damage, which can cause them to suffer against any enemy ships with armoring or with large enough hull sizes to protect their internal components. This is mainly due to their semi-armor piercing shells being almost solid shot and rather finicky to deal damage with. The British destroyers also tend to stick with smaller gun sizes and rely on their rate of fire to make up for it, which can feel rather lackluster at times, especially with the long shell flight times that makes your shells fairly easy for enemies to dodge. While these ships certainly have the maneuverability to dodge enemy fire and maintain fairly average top speeds that makes disengaging from fights fairly easy, these ships have a hard time fighting back as they tend to list heavily during hard turns. This can make utilizing these ships in brawls rather frustrating as your guns will constantly be unable to fire. Tanking some hits to return fire is also ill-advised with these ships as they tend to have fairly low crew counts and take damage rather easily due to lacking any armoring. On the plus side though, these destroyers have great anti-aircraft guns that will obliterate any planes that wander within 3.5 to 4 kilometers of your ship, so you can focus all your attention on the surface battles. These ships also get great torpedoes that allow you to hold back from choke points and wreak havoc on the enemy team at the same time. The only downside to these torpedoes is that most of the launcher setups have fairly small and annoying firing arcs that force you to be almost perfectly broadside in order to use them. These ships can most certainly be fun at times, but the high explosive spamming jack-of-all-trades style of gameplay isn't for everybody. I would say the standout ships for the British destroyers are the HMS Saumarez due to its all-around good characteristics at a very early battle rating, and HMS Daring as it feels like a British version of the USS Gearing, albeit with much better torpedoes. Moving on to the British cruisers, for this line I won't be separating the heavy cruisers from the light cruisers, as both types share very similar styles of shipbuilding and gameplay. The British cruisers overall are very survivable for cruisers despite seemingly lacking much external armor. This survivability comes from their citadel and critical components being extremely well protected by both armor and depth below the waterline, making them extremely hard to detonate and forcing opponents to slowly whittle away at their large crew counts in order to sink them. They do, however, tend to lose their bridge at the slightest breeze, so expect to be repairing that constantly. These ships also continue the destroyer's ability to instantly remove anything from the sky that flies too close to them, so you can focus on using your good maneuverability and average speeds to hamper the enemy's attempts to sink you even further. Though be aware that many of these cruisers share the listing problems that the destroyers had during hard turns, so you'll have to keep that in mind if you get into brawls. These ships do, however, falter when it comes to their firepower though. While they do have great rates of fire and can absolutely decimate any lighter ships they see, these cruisers struggle against any ships with decent armoring as they lack any proper armor-piercing shells. British cruisers strictly only get high explosive and semi-armor piercing shells, which while they are both extremely good for their ammo types, will leave you wanting when it comes to dealing with many enemy heavy cruisers or early battleships. Luckily, the British heavy cruiser's semi-armor piercing ammo's massive amount of explosive filler lets you open large holes at the waterlines of enemy ships and either distract them with repairs or flood them out completely, giving you at least some ways to fight back. The majority of the British cruisers do come equipped with great torpedoes, though most of them have very restrictive firing arcs that only make them useful while you are disengaging from fights or kiting enemies at range. Despite these ships struggling against armored opponents, I had quite a bit of fun with them. I would say the standout ships are the HMNZS Leander and the HMS Liverpool, both of these being light cruisers that can absolutely bully a majority of the enemies that they encounter through sheer rates of fire. And lastly, we come to the battleships and battle cruisers. The British battleships and battle cruisers can be easily summed up with a simple survivability triangle. If you had to balance between firepower, speed, and survivability, the British battleships put every last point into survivability. Outside of the early battleships' proclivity to explode at the smallest turret fire, these ships will take a beating and just keep sailing through it all. They take the cruiser's idea of deep set and extremely well protected citadels and magazines and turn it up to 11 by tossing on even more armor all over the ships, forcing your enemies to work extremely hard to pick away at their crew counts. Outside of the aforementioned early ships, they tend to be extremely resistant to exploding from turret fires and will tank multiple fires in the same spot without even worrying about a detonation. This does cost the British battleships though, as outside of the battle cruisers they tend to be rather ponderous in speed and maneuverability, and their firepower can be described as finicky at best. These ships tend to be very inaccurate, with guns that have extremely low velocities. The slow plunging arcs of the shells causes you to constantly have to aim for deck penetrations, even at closer ranges, and makes them very easy for enemy ships to dodge. This is coupled with a below average 35-second reload across the board, and shells that are rather finicky to get to penetrate. While the shells themselves have amazing amounts of explosive filler and are devastating when they penetrate into a ship, they tend to deflect off armor or get negated by light superstructures, even in areas that should be a surefire penetration. The slow reload and shell flights are bad enough, but the double dice roll of the accuracy and the finicky shells can be extremely frustrating at times, though the better ships in the line can negate this somewhat by pushing straight into close range brawls with their survivability and forcing the shells to work. At the very least, many of these ships do have great anti-aircraft armaments, so the planes will be less of an issue as you push in to make your guns perform. It's certainly a weird lineup of battleships where the extremely early ones are powerful, the middle tier of battleships is fun, and the highest tiers are rather frustrating and feel underwhelming when compared to other nations outside of their survivability characteristics. I would say the standout ships for the British battleships and battle cruisers are HMS Centurion and HMS Prince of Wales, both for being absolute tanks that make a lot of players just refuse to shoot at you because they're so tanky. I would also like to spotlight HMS Invincible as well, as it can absolutely bully the vast majority of ships that it can see at its very low battle rating. As far as my overall line opinion goes, while I did have lots of fun early on in this line, once I hit the battleships it kind of became a slog to grind through due to the frustrating guns that they tend to have. The playstyle of most of this line, being very reliant on high explosive and semi-armor piercing ammo, is rather unique compared to anything else I have played so far, and it was neat to experience, but I think the other lines just perform better overall in most regards. This isn't saying I wouldn't go back and play a few of the ships again for fun, but there are a lot that I wouldn't want to touch again for that purpose. This line really doesn't pay off at the end either currently, as it doesn't have a proper top tier battleship to compete with the other nations, and HMS Vanguard honestly feels over-tiered at 8.3. Would I suggest this line to other players? Maybe early parts for learning destroyers and cruisers, with ships that can be rather forgiving while performing all roles well, but overall I would suggest for people to grind the other lines first if they were going for a top tier battleship. Good luck out there guys, and I'll see you in the next one.